today I wanted to focus specifically on hegemony without sort of putting other themes there together, because it leads on quite well from what we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. And then I was also asked to remind you about the Trump lecture. Have you on Thursday? Yeah, did you get an email about that?
What lecture?
Trump.
Trump lecture?
No. It's Michelle Farrell is giving a public lecture on Donald Trump and what it has to do with international law. And then I also wanted to remind you of the public lecture given by Kate Evans in April, and it's just being released. That's going to be a public lecture on the refugee crisis, but Kate Evans is a cartoonist and an activist, and so she's written cartoons on various interesting topics, and one of them, so her new book, is going to be on the refugee crisis, and at Liverpool we're going to get an exclusive preview of this new graphic. It's not really a graphic novel, but I suppose it's a graphic
strip. Not a command button.
Graphic story or graphic narration of the refugee crisis, which will be great, because Kate's also just a fantastic speaker, so that should be good. Those two things I wanted to remind you of. Okay, so this week then we're going to be looking at international criminal law and hegemony, and we've spoken about hegemony before in various ways, and now we're going to think more specifically about what hegemony means. So, first of all, last week, international law and politics. What did we say? In which ways is international criminal law political? Short-term memory.
They can be used to demonize an opponent.
Yes, it demonizes opponents. Yes, right. So the way in which, one way of speaking about the politics of international criminal law is to say that politics is about dividing and categorizing into friends and enemies. And this was the article by Walter Van Ernst and Sarah Norman, which said that Uganda and Sudan are good examples of where the participants have been cast as either friends or enemies, and are using the International Criminal Court for this way of casting themselves in regard to the government of Uganda as friends, and then the Lord's Resistance Army as enemies, and when it comes to Sudan, it's the government who are the enemies, and any kind of resistance to that, the friends of the International Criminal Court. What did we say then, that what might be problematic with looking at international criminal law and the various ways in which it's political? What we ended on thinking about the difference between politics and ideology. What does ideology add to that critical lens on the politics of international criminal law? What do we say is the difference between politics and ideology? Everyone's looking down. So this reminded us of the work that we've been reading by Tor Kripa, in which he says that deeming international criminal law as political can also be problematic in that it hides the structural problems at play. So it looks at all of the different situations on their own and says international criminal law is political because it casts some as friends and some as enemies, because it's gendered, because it has this racial lens. So there are various ways in which the politics of international criminal court law comes to the fore, but the ideological lens allows us then to see that as those as structural problems, that there are structural reasons why international criminal law racializes victims, that there are structural reasons why there are no prosecutions of Western leaders, that there are structural reasons why international criminal law is unable to look at root causes of conflict. Yeah, does that make does that make sense? The difference between politics and ideology. So that's what we ended on last week, and so the reading for this week by Kamari Clark leads on from that, because her particular concern has been about the way in which Africa has been portrayed in international criminal justice and the political economy of that. And so she highlights then, while we said international criminal law is unable to look at the root causes of conflict, she actually tells us what that means. Okay, so how did you find the reading, first of all? Okay? Yeah?
Last week.
Forgotten. So, I'm rereading it. I think it's great because there are so many themes coming into it. But I think, and it's incredibly rich, but in academic speak, saying that the paper is rich also often means that there are many, many, many ideas in there. And it can be a bit overwhelming. So I found it quite overwhelming in how she pulls all these different themes together, and sometimes doesn't really explain how one thought leads to another. So I think it's an incredibly valuable piece, because we've read some of the background, but as a first piece this would definitely be too much, I think. Okay, so there are many things in there. What I'd like you to do with your neighbour is just discuss what was the most important thing you took out of this article. As we said before, there are always multiple readings of articles like this, and so I'd like you to just discuss what was the most interesting thing that you thought came out of this. To theorize precisely this point of consent. Yeah. Individualization of guilt. Okay, so what other theme? Any additions or questions on consent or?
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I mean, because I do agree with that argument. The fact that even if they've consented to it, there are structural issues behind it. But then, what of the times where African states have actually signed up? I don't know if it was Gambia, where the question was whether one president refused to leave because he had been threatened by the incoming that he'd take him to the ICC. At what point then? Obviously, that's still I'm not sure whether that's related to the structural issue, or whether it's another issue that that has to be addressed. I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, so this argument is not about saying those presidents who are dictators and who have caused mass violence to happen, that they should be necessarily should go off free. It's not about saying that. It's about saying that their actions should be seen in context, in a wider context. Does that make sense? What Kamara Clark and others have argued is that we need to think about that context and then think about whether there is a place for international criminal law within that. But one of the things what she sort of starts off with is by saying it used to be mainly Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and then it turned into this tribunalisation and international criminal justice. So this is sort of the historical narrative that she's presenting. So she said previously in Africa there was, and also when it came to internationalisation of these questions, the idea was first secure peace and then look at justice. So Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and that later is this tribunalisation. This is sort of in the 80s and 90s, and then we've got increasingly, up until today, ICL is seen as the form of justice for Africa. And Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so you've just had your seminar with Alex. What are the differences then with Truth and Reconciliation Commission and tribunals? What are the differences? Sorry?
Effectiveness, tribunal passes a judgment, and the Chief Commission just tries to help them with that.
Yes, I think you've jumped ahead. Let's go back to some of the more basics.
Well, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions only have recommendatory power in terms of some of what they recommend, but then tribunals have prosecutory power.
Yes, you're looking at effectiveness as well.
Truth commissions merely seek to find truth and find out what happened, facts behind, certain atrocities or human rights violations or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas tribunals seek to prosecute people for the role they played in the shit.
Yeah, so the way Tamara Clark thinks about this is that there was an opportunity to narrativise the suffering for the victims with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They themselves are problematic and have been problematic, of course, also perhaps because of effectiveness questions. But if you critique effectiveness, I think it's very important to think about short term and long term. So tribunals seem to be more effective because you have a guilty or not guilty verdict at the end of it. But we're not looking at guilty or not guilty as the desired outcome. The desired outcome is stability and peace and a prosperous country. And for that, you need a more longer term view. So South Africa then perhaps being actually a really good example of where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have led to a more stable country. Of course, there are many problems with South Africa, but in contrast to Sudan, for example, it's looking pretty shipshape. So in the 80s and 90s, there was this a desire for giving victims this voice, letting them, enabling them to tell their story, and then forgiveness. And forgiveness meant amnesties. Yeah? So you've got amnesties for those, which means no prosecution in effect. Yeah? You've got amnesties for all of those who have committed crimes. There's the recognition that crimes have been committed, and that's it. So we've got South Africa, Sierra Leone, Rwanda. Of course, with Sierra Leone and Rwanda coming in, there's then also, because they're at a slightly later stage, there's also the tribunals. And what I wanted to just show you are some differences in the, so we all know Amnesty International. Some posters, Amnesty International, in the 1980s, so if we take this one here, they're all quite similar. Okay, so what these posters are showing are political prisoners, right? So this dude here behind the barbed wire, whatever, there's the assumption this is an innocent perhaps a political prisoner who's dissented against that government. It's similar here, right? Someone behind bars, and here, and then there's the idea that amnesties, so not prosecuting, will lead to freedom and so on. So this is what Amnesty International was about. It was about not prosecuting, and it was instrumental also in the struggle for recognition. Here is the same thing, the bars and then the peace symbol and so on. But the more recent campaigns of amnesty have been for fighting impunity. So while in the 1980s and also partly in the 1990s they were fighting to free people from prison, more recently Amnesty International is trying to get people into prison. Now that's important for our understanding of the changes which have occurred in notions of justice. Yeah? So the notions of justice being amnesties are important for peace, to fighting impunity is important for peace. And this is also what Kamari Clark says, because she says it used to be that any kind of notions of justice came after the peace negotiations. And for the peace negotiations, mostly you needed to see South Africa, you needed amnesties. You needed people to be told that they were not going to get prosecuted, and then at some point you could have some kind of justice mechanisms, of course no prosecution, but instead these truth and reconciliation commissions which speak to narrativizing, if that's victims. However, and suffering. With international criminal justice, you have international criminal justice intervening into an ongoing conflict. Sudan is an excellent example. Sudan still problems at present. Most significantly at the moment, a huge, in South Sudan, a huge famine happening. Again, famine is usually presented to us as this thing that just happens through some kind of higher force. Not the case, of course. Famine happens because you've got displacement of people who are unable to access food. You've got conflict, so you've got the competition for any kind of access to food. And then you've got drought, which of course is not also something which just happens, but is largely down to issues of climate change, where mainly Western states have fucked up the environment and it's having an impact on the global south. So those who have least contributed to climate change are having the largest, paying the largest price for it. Anyway, so famine. So all of these issues are issues which international criminal justice has no means to examine. Because in the courtroom, you're just looking at the individual guilt or non-guilt, innocence of the accused. Of course, what comes against that background is, of course, the relevance also is that international criminal justice often presumes the guilt of the person who's been arrested. So, Omar al-Bashir, International Criminal Court has an arrest warrant on him. The next day, he expels all aid agencies who are working in Sudan. Again, a direct correlation between intervention of the ICC and aid not being able to go to those who need it. So the ICC took into account that people would be suffering on behalf of its intervention, on behalf of the arrest warrant, and it still decided to intervene. Okay, So, individualization of guilt and the transition from truth and reconciliation commissions to individual accountability. I get a sense of how you're being taught by Alex and Podrick if you're looking at effectiveness. But I would urge you to think in terms of effectiveness, more longer term, right? So effectiveness is not just about getting a guilty or innocent outcome. Okay, what have we forgotten? So, important or aspects which did any of you have a different view on what was the most important point in Kamara Clark's piece? What did the two of you, Cal and Brian, what did you discuss?
Well, I was discussing, I've got it, I was just rephrasing it. I was regarding the Sudan's oil fields.
Yes.
When different corporations are coming in and exploiting it.
Yes.
The idea that occurred to me was the UN taking control of the assets in a similar way to manage the states through the decolonization process.
Yes. So this is a very important aspect and one we'll be looking at further. So it's a nice sort of introduction at next week when we're looking at specifically the practices of political economy. In this case, you've got the ICC intervening in Sudan, and then you've got it's some kind of economic repercussions. So you've got the freezing of assets or embargoes. So all the intervention, international criminal intervention, always comes with some form of monetary value. In the intervention in Libya, and then the arrest warrant on Gaddafi, the US and the UK, they said, okay, we've intervened, Gaddafi's dead, somehow mysteriously through Crossfire, and we'll find out what happened really. We have secured 33 billion US dollars of assets, we've frozen those, they belong to Gaddafi, and we're going to use them to rebuild Libya. What happened to Libya?
Still being rebuilt.
Being balkanized.
It's completely destabilized. It's completely destabilized at the moment. It has no economy to speak of. It has become a hub of ISIS. It has no government to speak of. It has no economic growth whatsoever. So Libya was under Gaddafi, under a dictatorship, but was a prosperous country. Similarly, well, of course, also because of the oil fields, and most importantly, if we're talking about hegemony, it was the North African hegemon. It was the prosperous country which decided on trade deals, which gave aid to other North African countries, and which gave sort of political clout to any kind of ongoing issues, had an important position in Africa, in the African Union, and so on. Intervention happens through Western states, and Libya is a mess. Complete mess. Not even 6 years later, it's a complete and utter mess. Aidan, sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that I think it was called the Somalia of the Mediterranean, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically a failed state, whatever that means, and that obviously has a lot of problematic aspects to it. But it's and of course it's one of the main hubs. It not only has refugees fleeing from it because people want to get away, but it's the main hub of refugee movement from Africa because of its proximity to Europe, and because it has no borders to speak of, and so you've got these entrepreneurs who are promising riches and whatever may come with getting to Europe. So we've got intervention through international institutions, including the ICC, and the mysterious freezing of assets and losing of billions of US dollars. Of course, it's unclear whether they were there in the first place, but anyway, they probably were, considering Libya is such an oil-rich country. And rather than this money going into the reconstruction of Libya, it's kind of disappeared, right? So we don't want to make necessarily any concrete causal assumptions there. But what we do know is that intervention has not led to peace and stability, but intervention has led to instability and the ongoing of conflict. So even if you may have an effective guilty verdict, at the end you don't necessarily have the peace that we would hope comes with that. So any questions up to now? We'll look more at the political economy, but I think this is a good point for Brian to talk about South Africa and all.
Different sides of the story. So like, it's not just getting away and all these things and whatever. There are problems. What? Just realized.
Just remember.
I was saying that.
Same happened during transition justice.
What he was here to be.
You see, nobody said, look, I just think about with Amnesty International being promoting regime in Syria.
Yeah.
Are they not part of the consent regime?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is there are really interesting books which have been written about it in the 90s, and aligned itself with state power beforehand. Karen Abels has written about this, and Stephen Hawking was beforehand, it was against state power. So the transition from truth and reconciliation to international criminal justice seems to me that in terms of very computerized focus to against state power to prosecution is the exertion of power by the state, so Brian.
Thanks. So I was supposed to look at South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC, and here is a mini presentation that I put together. So this first slide just goes to show the timeline of South Africa's involvement with the ICC, and it dates back from 17th July 1998, when they first signed the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which was then ratified on the 27th of November 2000 and sort of entered into force as binding South Africa on the 1st of July 2002. And then on the 21st of October 2016, South Africa made a request to withdraw from the ICC, of which you will see later in the presentation. And then on the 22nd of February 2017, just last month, there was a High Court decision invalidating the notice to withdraw from the ICC. So what happened? This whole stems from what I chose to call the al-Bashir debacle. And the real reason why South Africa was sort of gearing up to withdraw quite a bit was what sort of stemmed when Sudan's president Omar al-Bashir was in South Africa. And an ICC arrest warrant had been issued against al-Bashir, who at the time had been in South Africa attending a state function. And there was a lot of pressure for South Africa to arrest Omar al-Bashir in South Africa, who went on to leave South Africa without being arrested. And this lends to the fact that South Africa, in its effort to domesticate the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, came up with what they called the implementation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court Act of 2002. And of particular relevance to al-Bashir was Chapter 2 of that Act, which provided for execution of ICC arrest warrants, in this case arresting al-Bashir, and domestic prosecution of international crimes, again quite relevant to the al-Bashir case. So a question that was quite pertinent was, would the arrest be a violation of customary international law rules on immunity, which is what South Africa tried to say, that there is immunity that sitting heads of states enjoy in international law, and who is South Africa to go and arrest Omar al-Bashir? That is what they tried to argue as to why they could not arrest him. And al-Bashir had been sort of accused of war crimes in Darfur and alleged genocide in Darfur as well. So South Africa wants to withdraw from the ICC, but is it legal under international law? So first of all, under international law, on the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, with the Rome Statute being a treaty, under its Article 54, it provides that compliance with the provisions for withdrawal are set out in the treaty. And under Articles 127 of the Rome Statute, it sets out the procedure for withdrawal. But under South Africa's domestic law specifically, in its constitution, there is silence as to any withdrawal procedures from international treaties. But under Section 231 of the Constitution, it says that, and this is what was quite crucial with the High Court ruling on South Africa's withdrawal, that there has to be parliamentary approval before the state can sort of make steps to withdraw from an international treaty. And this is where, as we'll see ahead, South Africa, the High Court, is hinging its main argument. So some of the reactions to the withdrawal were the following. Amnesty International said South Africa's sudden notice to withdraw from the ICC is a betrayal to millions of victims of the gravest human rights violations, obviously making reference to the apartheid era regime in South Africa. And then it also went ahead to say South Africa's support for the ICC after the country suffered through decades of apartheid was an important and crucial step towards creating rights and respecting societies around the world. So for them to come around again and say that they want to withdraw from the ICC is a bit of a shame. This is just a screenshot of the notice of the instrument to withdraw from the ICC that was drafted by the Minister of Internal Relations and Cooperation. So that being said, the High Court's decision that went on to invalidate the decision to withdraw on the 22nd of February 2017 asked the question whether the executive can withdraw from an international treaty which had been ratified and domesticated by Parliament without prior parliamentary approval. And since there had not been any parliamentary approval, as according to Section 231(2) of the South African Constitution, which requires parliamentary approval for treaty subject to ratification, the section also by implication requires the consent of Parliament to withdraw from such treaties. And since there was no consent by the South African Parliament to withdraw from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the High Court in South Africa found that decision to withdraw as invalid and revoked it. So that is where we stand as of right now. But then what would have been the regional implications of the withdrawal if South Africa had gone ahead and withdrawn from the ICC? The regional implications would have been as follows. There had already been a lot of talks by other African states to withdraw. Case in point being the Gambia, which is that long strip on the top right-hand side. And then there is Burundi on the bottom left. And then there's Kenya as well, which have indicated intention to withdraw from the ICC. But perhaps more crucially is the logo at the bottom, which is the logo for the African Union. That would have had massive implications for the withdrawal of South Africa, because there would have been renewed efforts by the African Union to perhaps set up or carry on with plans to set up a court of the same stature as the International Criminal Court on the African continent, to perhaps try some of the crimes that the International Criminal Court tries. And if that had gone forward, there would have been tremendous implications as to the current sitting heads of state, because they would have had a lot of political buy-in into that African version of the criminal court. But then that would also have seen a bloc movement amongst African states to withdraw from the ICC. And this is because South Africa is such a key player on the African continent and wields such a lot of power on the African continent. So their gesture would have had implications on the continent. And some implications for the ICC specifically of the withdrawal of South Africa is that the withdrawal would have threatened the legitimacy of the ICC, because South Africa was the first state on the African continent to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So if the first person to give consent to be bound by the Rome Statute pulls out, then that doesn't really leave much to say for the other states who follow South Africa on the continent. And then it perhaps would have weakened the ICC since South Africa's previous history of supporting the court, particularly through the Nelson Mandela regime. There was a lot of support for the ICC, and it was very welcome, particularly when the ICC was when South Africa was pulling out of the apartheid era. And then, as you mentioned, the domino effects that South Africa's withdrawal would have had, where a bloc perhaps withdrawn by other African states would have followed. So that was just a quick glimpse as to South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC, what the High Court said, and what possible implications there could have been. If there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them. And I found this quite interesting. I found that it paints a very vivid clear of the ICC, particularly in relation to hegemony, and particularly with the United Nations, where the United Nations will be so quick to say that any outburst of national sovereignty will be found in contempt of this court. So it also brings the perspective of states and sovereignty in international law into perspective. So, yeah, I would be more than happy to take any questions on this.
Yeah, just a question. What do you think of the fact that in Burundi in 2015, and I think Kenya was the same thing as well, before these withdrawal issues came up, there was some sort of violence where quite a lot of people died. Do you think that played a part? And you think that's another concern which should be looked at, or do you think it's just part of the whole, the whole problem that we've been looking at?
Concern that we looked at by who?
No, in Burundi and Kenya. So before this, the whole withdrawal, there was violence, then political violence, should I say? Do you think that's something that should be looked at, or do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely think, and I can speak for Kenya specifically, because there had been cases at the ICC against the current head of state of Kenya and the current vice president of Kenya for crimes against humanity that had been committed in 2007-2008 after the elections then, which were followed by post-election violence. And it was very strategic of them to say that they were going to withdraw out of the ICC right when investigations were going on against them. Now, since then, the investigations have been dropped, but there hasn't been sort of any formal verbal expressions that have been made by the government to say that they are going to stop the withdrawing. And I would perhaps assume it's the same case in Burundi, because there was perhaps a threat of investigations into war crimes and crimes against humanity that had been committed in Burundi. It was sort of, for lack of a better phrase, the leaders covering their asses by withdrawing and hoping for a similar court in Africa where they would sort of play puppets and pull strings. But that's also just one side of the coin.
Yeah, of course,
There's other sides of the coin to that story as well. Are there any questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant. So, just a few points. of invoking Mandela and apartheid. Now, immediately after the news broke that South Africa had started the process to withdraw from the ICC, which meant notification to the UN, all these NGOs, and South Africa has a very rich history of having civil society organisations and grassroots organisations, and they all immediately said, this is not in the spirit of Mandela, and this is not how we overcame apartheid. But of course the paradoxical issue there is that, what I said earlier, the apartheid regime, part of moving on from the apartheid regime to post-apartheid was through amnesties. Right? So then these NGOs invoking that this is not in the spirit of Mandela is actually not true, because at that time it was seen as politically disruptive of a peace process to have prosecutions. In terms of the South African interest in withdrawing from the ICC, there is an ongoing investigation against South Africa in terms of a potential a violation of the Rome Statute by not arresting al-Bashir when he was there. It was actually an African Union summit meeting. South Africa, therefore, sort of having an interest in withdrawing in sort of along the lines of what you said in regard to Burundi and in regard to Kenya. But the thing about the Rome Statute is that it says that no state can, by withdrawing, get out of its ongoing investigations and obligations. So the latest is that South Africa has withdrawn its withdrawal, but this is not the end of the road, because this will still go before Parliament, and Parliament will decide whether the power should be conferred onto the government to withdraw if it wants to. So it's been paused, let's say. My South African friends all say that Parliament will be in favour of withdrawal. They have no question about that, which is surprising again, possibly surprising against this background. We know that there's civil society organisations who are very influential in the press and who are all saying this is against the spirit of South Africa, but we also have a conflicting information saying that the Parliament will probably be in favour of withdrawal. In the meantime, we'll see what will be politically convenient to withdraw or not to withdraw, and whether anything happens to this African Criminal Court. The African Criminal Court has been notionally set up through what is known as the Malabo Protocol, and South Africa was a key figure in pushing for this, but I think has not even signed up to it. I don't know whether I can't remember, I don't think it's even signed up to it. The issue of the African Criminal Court is that there's really positive things about it. So we've said that some of these crimes, which are not crimes at the ICC, are in fact crimes at the African Criminal Court. So it has a wider expanse of crimes, including economic crimes, so corruption and so on. But it is underfunded at the moment, and the main issue seems to be, will it ever get funding to actually happen? In the meantime, there is the ICC. The key difference with the Malabo Protocol is also that it has a provision for the immunity of sitting heads of state. So this is the key difference, and the main reason why people are saying this is sort of to protect to protect dictators. So South Africa and the ICC, it's a really interesting case study, if you will, of all the different interests and the the tensions within international criminal law, having itself a quite successful history of moving from apartheid now to a more peaceful society. Apartheid, just one sort of final connection to Kamari Clark's article, in which apartheid came up as one of the potential crimes that the ICC was going to have jurisdiction over, and then states said, why should we criminalise apartheid, because it's a thing of the past. What can you say about that? Where can we see contemporary apartheid?
Pakistan.
Absolutely, it's an apartheid regime without question. But it's not politically convenient to name it as such.
Is Israel itself apartheid?
Well, you can say that is the apartheid regime that worked there, yeah.
I mean, within Israel rather than within the structure of Israel rather than in Palestine.
The Gaza.
Was that what you actually meant?
Wasn't the revolution you read the post?
Israel and Palestine.
Used the word apartheid.
Yes.
Palestine as a
Yes.
separate state.
So Aidan just mentioned something important, that there was a UN report which mentioned the word apartheid. It's a bit like the word genocide, isn't it? That if it has so much emotive appeal that it should lead to some kind of reaction. However, this kind of report was buried, and again, it didn't attract the attention of the media, which is where we need to think back to the question of manufacturing consent and what it is that is presented to us as urgent and as requiring our attention. Okay, so thanks very much, and then I'll see you next week when we put together the two political economy and victims. And in terms of your preparation, if you look at the questions on victimhood, because they sort of include the political economy elements anyway, and we'll look further at the practice, the actual practice of political economy and international law. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.